All right, so you guys wanted to hear more about this political ferret character, and honestly, I kind of get it.
Yeah, he's definitely thought-provoking.
Yeah, I mean, the dude's he's got some interesting ideas. I mean, Austrian libertarian YouTuber, throws out some hot takes. But we're going to try to break down one of his big arguments, one he keeps coming back to, about this whole alliance between rich and poor that he thinks leads to like civilizations collapsing.
Yeah, it's kind of the central thread running through, I think, a lot of his work.
Right. And it's a pretty bleak picture, right? He's basically saying we're on this like historical train wreck in slow motion.
Yeah, and he uses history as kind of, the evidence to say, like, this is how it's always happened, so watch out, basically.
Yeah, he's like, hey, this is how Rome fell, this is how other empires bit the dust, and we're doing the same thing now. That's a little bit scary, honestly. But, okay, let's unpack it. So where does this alliance even come from? You'd think the rich and the poor would be, like, natural enemies, right?
Yeah. Well, he's not saying they, like, team up officially. More like there are these forces at play that kind of push them together. And in the process, they end up squeezing out the middle class.
The middle stand, as he calls it.
Yeah, exactly. Middle stand, like the German word. He sees that middle class as the bedrock of a strong society.
Yeah, and he's saying that without a strong middle class, societies basically start to rot from the inside out.
Right. Like when people can climb the ladder, when there's opportunity, that's when you get innovation and a thriving economy, and everyone feels like they've got a stake in things.
Makes sense. But then what happens? Why does this middle class start to disappear?
Well, he's got this whole theory about how it goes down, and it's not pretty. Basically, he says the rich and the poor end up working together to undermine the middle class, but it's not always intentional, he says. Like on the rich side, you've got these powerful people manipulating the system to stay on top.
Okay, so it's like they're rigging the game in their favor.
Pretty much. He uses this analogy of a bureaucratic rule, calls it a Passagerschein A38, I think.
A Passagerschein A38.
Yeah, it's this totally made up thing. But the point is, it sounds all neutral and official, like just some random regulation. But in reality, it's designed to screw over small businesses while letting big corporations slide right through.
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts for the middle class.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you've got the poor. And he has this a pretty controversial view of intellectuals, like academics and writers and stuff. He thinks they get used by the elite to manipulate the masses.
Wait, really? I mean, intellectuals are usually seen as like the champions of the people, right?
Yeah.
Fighting for social justice and all that.
Well, he's pretty cynical about it. He basically says they get seduced by these utopian ideas, these grand theories about equality, and end up pushing for policies that sound good on paper but actually hurt the middle class the most.
So they're like pawns in the game without even realizing it.
That's how he sees it. And it creates this weird dynamic where the rich are pulling the strings from above, the poor are being used from below, and the middle class is stuck in the middle, getting squeezed from both sides.
Ouch. And so what's the end game here? What happens when the middle class is gone?
Well, basically everything falls apart. Innovation stalls, the economy stagnates, social mobility dies, and eventually the whole system collapses.
Not exactly a happy ending, huh?
Not at all. He actually compares modern Western societies to, like, the late Soviet Union, which is a pretty bold statement, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty bleak picture. So basically, we're all doomed. Is that it? Is there any hope?
I mean, he does offer, like, glimmers of hope. It's not all doom and gloom, right? He does talk about ways to, potentially change course.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. So where do we even start? It all sounds so, I don't know, inevitable. Like, how can we possibly stop something this big from happening?
Well, he keeps coming back to this idea of, like, empowering the middle class, making it easier for small businesses to thrive, cutting the red tape, that kind of thing.
So less government interference, less regulation. Kind of a classic libertarian stance, right?
Yeah, for sure. He's definitely a believer in, like, free markets and limited government. He'd probably say that a lot of the problems we're facing are actually caused by too much government intervention.
Interesting. Okay, but what about the other side of the equation? Remember, he was talking about the poor being manipulated by these intellectuals. How do we address that?
Right. He's really big on education, but not in the traditional sense. It's more about, like, critical thinking skills, teaching people how to, see through the BS, to think for themselves.
So, like, developing your own internal BS detector.
Exactly. He thinks that if people can, learn to question the narratives they're being fed, they'll be less likely to get manipulated.
Which, let's be honest, is a pretty useful skill to have these days.
Yeah, for real. I mean, everyone's trying to spin things to their advantage, right? Politicians, the media, even like influencers on social media.
True, true. So how do we actually teach people to think more critically? Is this something that can be done in schools, or is it more like a personal journey, figuring it out on your own?
I think it's probably a combination of both. He definitely stresses the importance of exposing yourself to different perspectives, challenging your own assumptions, that kind of thing.
So like reading different news sources, talking to people who have different opinions than you.
Yeah, exactly. It's about not getting stuck in an echo chamber, actually listening to what other people have to say, even if you don't agree with them.
And this is supposed to help us break free from this whole cycle of manipulation he's talking about.
Yeah, because if more people are able to think critically, to see through the propaganda, it becomes a lot harder to control them, right?
Makes sense.
Yep.
So critical thinking is like our weapon against the powers that be.
Haha. Yeah, I guess you could say that. It's about empowering individuals to, make informed decisions and hold those in power accountable.
All right, I'm feeling a little more empowered already. But let's not forget about those other issues Political Ferret brought up. The declining trust in institutions, the rising social problems, all that stuff. How do we deal with those?
Yeah, those are tough ones. He actually talks a lot about rebuilding trust in institutions, making them more transparent, more accountable to the people they're supposed to serve.
So less secrecy, more openness, more of a focus on the public good rather than like special interests.
Right. People need to feel like they have a voice, like the system is actually working for them, not just for the elites.
But how do we even get there? It feels like there's so much distrust and cynicism right now.
Yeah, it's a tough one. But one thing he emphasizes is that, history is cyclical. Societies go through these periods of growth and decline.
So it's like a pendulum swinging back and forth.
Exactly. And even though things might seem pretty bleak right now, he's suggesting that we might be nearing the end of one of those cycles, like maybe we're on the verge of a new era.
Okay, so there's hope then. Maybe we're not all doomed after all.
Maybe not. But he definitely thinks we, like the current generation, have a responsibility to, try to steer things in the right direction.
No pressure or anything.
Right. Haha. But yeah, he's basically saying that it's not enough to just sit back and wait for things to change. We have to be active participants in shaping the future we want to see.
So we've talked about empowering the middle class, fostering critical thinking, and rebuilding trust. Anything else? What else can we do to, avoid this societal collapse he keeps warning us about?
One thing that often gets overlooked, I think, is the importance of social cohesion. Like when people feel connected to their communities, when they have a sense of shared purpose, they're less likely to fall for, divisive rhetoric or turn against each other.
So it's about finding common ground, building bridges instead of walls, remembering that we're all in this together, even if we don't always see eye to eye on everything.
Exactly. It's about, recognizing our shared humanity even when we disagree on the specifics, and understanding that a healthy society depends on people being able to work together to find solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Okay, I like that. It's a nice message of hope and unity. A little bit of a change from all the doom and gloom.
Yeah, it's definitely more hopeful. But it's also a challenge, especially in the current political climate. It's so easy to get caught up in the outrage, the division, the us versus them mentality.
For sure. It's everywhere you look.
Right. But if we want to build a better future, we have to resist that temptation. We have to find ways to connect with each other, to build relationships based on trust and mutual respect.
Easier said than done, right? I mean, not everyone's going to be on board with this whole kumbaya thing. There are definitely people out there who are like actively trying to divide us, to exploit those differences for their own gain.
That's true. And that's where, Political Ferret's emphasis on critical thinking comes in again. We need to be aware of those tactics that are being used to manipulate us, to sow that division and distrust.
So we need to be aware of the manipulators, but also like resist the urge to become manipulators ourselves. Avoid falling into that trap of using fear and anger to score points or advance our own agenda.
Exactly. It's about breaking that cycle, choosing to engage in good faith, to listen with an open mind, and to seek that common ground, even when it's hard.
That's a tall order, but I think it's worth striving for. If we actually want to build that kind of society, Political Ferret's talking about, a society where the middle class thrives, where people are free to think for themselves, and where trust and cooperation win out.
I agree. And it starts with each of us, individually. We have to make that conscious choice to reject the politics of division and embrace a more positive, constructive approach.
So it's not just about changing the system, it's about changing ourselves.
I think so, yeah. A big part of it, at least. We can't just sit around waiting for someone else to fix things. We have to take responsibility for creating the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. Man, I'm feeling a lot more optimistic now than I did when we started this whole thing.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've talked about a lot of like solutions, right? Empowering the middle class, more critical thinking, rebuilding trust, all that. But I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the West kind of looking like the late Soviet Union. That's a pretty wild comparison. You think he's really onto something there? Or is that like exaggerating a bit?
It's definitely, it gets your attention, right? And
Yeah.
it's true, like, no historical parallel is ever going to be perfect. But yeah, there are some interesting, I don't know, echoes maybe, things that kind of rhyme, like you said, declining trust in institutions.
That sense of like things not really working even if everyone's got a fancy phone, right?
Yeah.
Like a kind of hollow prosperity.
Exactly. And he's saying, like, hey, the Soviet Union had all that too, right up until it didn't. So if we don't pay attention, we could be headed down the same road.
It's like the whole thing's built on sand, and nobody wants to admit it.
That's kind of his point, yeah. Like, things can seem fine on the surface, but underneath, it's all, crumbling, and then boom, sudden collapse.
Okay, well, that's terrifying. But didn't he also say something about future generations, like learning from our mistakes? Is he saying there's hope? Or are we just destined to screw it all up again?
I think he's saying we always have a choice. Right. We're not just like along for the ride, watching history happen. We can like actually make decisions, be informed, be engaged citizens, make different choices.
So it's not about like predicting the future, but more about learning the patterns and then trying to like steer things in a different direction.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where, that critical thinking stuff comes back in. We got to look at the evidence, consider different viewpoints, and then actually decide what we think is best. Can't just go with our gut or follow the crowd.
But there's so much information out there. How do you even know what to believe?
Right. It's overwhelming. But start with being curious, Don't be afraid to ask questions. Challenge the status quo. Read different stuff. Talk to people who disagree with you.
And be willing to change your mind, right? Like if the evidence says you're wrong.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, between being skeptical and also being open to learning new stuff.
Gotcha. Okay. But even if we all become like critical thinking ninjas, there's still going to be people in power who like benefit from things staying the same, right?
Okay.
How do you change that?
He actually talks a lot about that too. Like, individual change is important, but it's got to be combined with, collective action, social movements, political engagement. It's not enough to just think differently. You got to actually do something.
So like organize, protest, vote, all that.
Yeah. Find common ground with people, even if you disagree on some things. Because you need like a big movement if you actually want to change the system.
It's like individual change plus systemic change.
Right. You need both. One without the other isn't enough.
Man, this has been a wild ride. So much to think about. What's like the one thing you hope people take away from all this?
I think just remembering that we're not powerless, we can actually make a difference. But it takes, effort, critical thinking, and being willing to fight for what we believe in.
Not just accepting things as they are, right?
Yeah.
But asking ourselves, what kind of world do I want to live in and how can I help build it?
Exactly. That's a question everyone should be asking themselves.
Love that. Well, on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all this. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.